Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander, we are live. How are you doing in London?
I'm doing very well. I'm enjoying a nice, cold, wet day in London, where it has been the usual dark, overcast skies. We had Peter Lavelle here, as some of our viewers may know, on Monday and Tuesday, and we went to a sound-related events together. So that was fun. That was very interesting.
Okay, so if you guys heard Alexander, let us know. If you can hear me, let us know. If you can see us, let us know. Let's see where everyone is joining us from. Alexander, before we get started on a live stream about Erdogan, Russia, Turkey, Syria, everything that's going on there. Hello from Portugal. How you guys doing in Portugal? Bolivia. How's everyone doing in Bolivia? Greetings from the Netherlands. Thank you for joining us from the Netherlands. Hello from sunny Florida. Nice to have you from Florida. Let's see, we also have from New Zealand joining us. Chicago here. All right, Gleska News. Yes, loud and clear. Gleska News is a really cool YouTube channel. I recommend everyone check it out. We're subscribed to Gleska, so check out their channel. Moon Dragon from Sweden. How you doing in Sweden? Let's see. Hello from Carmel, India. Bonjour de Montreal. Hello, Montreal. Hello, Noreen. How are you? She says, hi, Alex and Alexander. Let's see. From Canada, BC, Huntington Beach, California, Guyana, Canada, Belfast. Hi from the UK, Andrew, Erica from New York, NYC. I lived in NYC for 6 years. Flushing, Queens. Hello from Friesland. Let's see. Virginia, USA in the house. Wales in the house. Louisiana in the house. Sri Lanka. Rural UK. Berkshire. Sparta. Hello from Sparta. Spartan warrior queen. Very cool. Let's see. Marie says video, audio good from West Virginia. London here. Serene from USA, Serbia. I'm planning a trip to Serbia very, very soon. So greetings to everybody from Serbia, our friends in Serbia. From South Africa. Hello from South Africa, our friends in South Africa, Paris, France, the home of Mr. Macron, Alexander.
Indeed.
President
Indeed.
Macron.
President Macron, he's trying to play a role in the Syrian crisis, but
we'll get into that. We'll get into that. From Iran, and then how is everyone doing in Iran? The coronavirus is really hitting Iran hard. There's news floating around that the vice president has it as well.
I believe it's true. I believe he has.
True.
Yeah, I think so. I believe so. I mean, anyway, several senior officials have it there. So.
New Mexico, USA, Napa Valley, North Florida, London, Alberta, Aloha.
Amazing wine, amazing wines in the Napa Valley.
Yes.
I'm a great fan.
Olga from Serbia. How are you, Olga? From Wales. Yes. Hello from Iran, USA, Slovakia. More from Slovakia. Hello from Turkey. How's everyone doing in Turkey? You guys are center stage in Turkey for this live stream. Hello from Ireland. Beautiful Ireland. Been there a bunch of times. I love that country. Let's see. Indianapolis, Texas. Are we ready to go, Alexander? You want to get started?
Well, absolutely. We've got so much to discuss. A situation which I think has been building up now for a long time in northwest Syria.
Do you need an introduction, Alexander? Let me introduce you. The Oracle of London, Alexander Mercouris. Alexander, you were saying before I introduced you to all our listeners, by the way, everybody, please subscribe. Please hit that like button. Check your subscription as well, because we know that YouTube is unsubscribing people. Me and Alexander get a lot of people who send us emails, or sometimes if they see us out and about in the city. I know you're in London, Alexander. When people say hello to you, many times they tell you that they were subscribed and they were unsubscribed. They had to resubscribe again. So please check your subscribe as well to make sure that YouTube hasn't done some sneaky stuff and removed you from our subscription. Alexander, you were giving the intro to this live stream.
Let's begin. We are in a situation now where there's an absolute standoff between Russia and Turkey over Idlib. It's been building up now for a year. Many people, including, by the way, myself, doubted it would get to this. We always assumed, I always assumed, that eventually Erdogan would pull back. It's instead what he's trying to do, it seems to me, is double down. And I think he's now in a very dangerous situation. And it's also clear to me that the Russians overestimated badly their ability to influence Erdogan. Anyway, so we now have a crisis. I should say that the breaking news, the news that we've just got just before we started this program, is that there's now apparently going to be a summit meeting between Putin and Erdogan. It's not going to be in Istanbul, where Erdogan wanted it. It's going to be in Moscow, and it'll probably be on the 5th or 6th of March. So in effect, Putin has summoned Erdogan to Moscow, as opposed to Putin going to Istanbul, where he would have been faced with Erdogan alongside Merkel and Macron. How did we get there? Well, first of all, we're talking about this province, this region of northwest Syria, Idlib province. It's always been a opposition heartland. A lot of the people in Idlib have very strong Sunni fundamentalist views. It was an area that was always, to a great extent, supported the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. It's also a region where the two great Sunni Wahhabi, perhaps I should say Takfiri rather than Wahhabi, terrorist movements, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but especially Al-Qaeda, have been extremely strong. And it was also a region which fell under complete opposition control in a great offensive that was launched by the rebels in Syria with the backing of Turkey in 2015. Now, what has been happening since 2015 is that in September of that year, the Russian military came into Syria. Since then, the Syrian army, backed by the Russians, has methodically regained control of nearly all of Syria, apart from certain Kurdish areas in the northeast of Syria and Idlib province. So all the great cities of Syria, Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Hama, Homs, all of these places now, and of course Damascus itself, are under Syrian government control, as is the region around Damascus, which is for a long time an opposition stronghold, which was East Ghouta. And we've also seen how one of these two great terrorist movements, ISIS, has been comprehensively defeated in Syria and driven out of control of its areas of control throughout central and eastern Syria. So that has left Idlib province as the last region which was still controlled by the jihadi opposition. And what happened over the course of the war is that as these other areas of Syria were cleared of opposition fighters, the Russians and the Turks brokered various agreements whereby these opposition fighters would be decanted and sent to Idlib. And the result is that we have a very large number of these opposition fighters in Idlib. And what has also happened over the last year or so is that the regional branch of Al-Qaeda, which used to be called Al-Nusra, the Al-Nusra Front, but now calls itself by a different name, that has now established itself as the dominant force in Idlib and is essentially in control of most of the fighters there. Now, what I had expected is that there would be a series of negotiations between the Russians and the Turks, and gradually and methodically, but more incrementally and peacefully, Idlib would eventually be brought in stages under the control of the Syrian government, in parallel with a political process to set up a new constitution. Well, and what appeared to start that in motion was a meeting that happened in the Russian resort city of Sochi, where Putin has his summer residence, between Putin and Erdogan, whereby it was agreed in December 2018 that Idlib would become a deconfliction area. The Turkish military would establish observation posts there and would separate the Al-Qaeda fighters from the rest. Well, none of that happened. The Turkish army did go into Idlib. There was no separation of the fighters. Instead, some of these fighters continued to launch attacks on Syrian government territory. And what I suspect concerned the Russians even further, they also launched missile attacks and drone attacks on the major Russian airbase near Latakia, in Latakia province, which is known as Khmeimim. And eventually, this January, the Syrian army was finally given the green light by the Russians to go into Idlib province and to secure not the entirety of Idlib province, but the two main roads leading from central Syria to this important northern city of Aleppo, which is the big industrial city of Syria. These are the M4 and M5 highway, and the result has been a major Syrian government offensive, which is ongoing. Now, this has provoked a very strong reaction from Erdogan. He has protested against this offensive. He has said that the offensive threatens the local population and is in some way a violation of the Sochi agreement of December 2018. And over the last few weeks, he has been pouring his own troops into Idlib province. And the result has been a major escalation over the last 2 days. Firstly, the Turkish-backed jihadi Al-Qaeda-led forces have captured or recaptured an important town called Sarakib, which is on the junction of the M4 and M5 highways, which lead, as I said, from central Syria to Aleppo. This has happened at the same time as the Syrian army has been carrying out a very major offensive operation in southern Idlib, which appears to have been gaining a great deal of ground. The result was an exchange of fire between the Syrian military and the Turkish military. It seems that there may have been some kind of air raid. The suggestions that the Russians were involved in that, but what is indisputable is that about 34 Turkish soldiers were killed, bringing the total number of Turkish soldiers killed in Idlib over the last 2 months to around 50. And the big question now is what happens next? Will there be a further escalation, as Erdogan has been threatening? Will negotiations prevail? Will the Syrian army slow down its offensive? Will the Turks provide more weapons to the various jihadi fighters in Idlib? And of course, will the Turkish army itself launch a counteroffensive against the Syrian army to carry through the threats President Erdogan has been making to force the Syrian army back to its original lines, which it held before the offensive began in January of this year. So that's the overall summary. We are in a crisis situation. Russian diplomacy has broken down. The Turks and the Syrians are fighting each other. It's quite possible the Russians are involved at some level also. And the big question now, it seems to me, is does Erdogan press on or does he pull back? And what will the Russians do?
You said the Russians might be involved. They have.
I think they are. I think they are absolutely involved. I mean, the Russians are there now. The question is, there was this air raid or attack on which killed all these Turkish troops overnight. There is
do you know what the exact number is, Alexander?
Well, 34 are the numbers that the Turks have admitted to, killed in one single incident. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this incident. The Turks say that it was the Syrian Air Force. They always try to blame the Syrians rather than the Russians. The Russians deny that it was their air force, but they also seem to be denying that it was the Syrian air force. The Turks are saying that it was an attack on one of their bases in Idlib province. The Russians seem to be insinuating that it wasn't, that there was no actual attack on any Turkish bases, and that these soldiers were killed during fighting, probably around Sarakib, and that in fact the Turkish troops were mixed up with the Al-Qaeda-led jihadi fighters and played a major role in the fighting there. So there's already that disagreement. There is, I have to say, yet another version of events, which is now circulating on the internet, which is that a Turkish base was attacked. And the reason it was attacked was because there was video film of jihadi fighters launching manpads, handheld anti-aircraft missiles at Russian and Syrian aircraft from this base, from a specific building in this base, and that this building was attacked in retaliation. So we have the classic fog of war situation. We don't know exactly what has been going on. What we do know is, as I said, that there was this major incident and that it has created a major crisis between Turkey and Syria and between Turkey and Russia.
Who do you think is behind this, Alexander? I mean, Syria wouldn't possibly and couldn't possibly take on Turkey.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Syrian army, there are parts of the Syrian army now which are very high, have achieved very high levels of confidence.
They're battle tested, no doubt about it, but they're also exhausted.
And they're also exhausted. And this is, in fact, one of the things that happened. We've just witnessed the effect of this in this battle in Idlib, because the reason these jihadi fighters led by Al-Qaeda and backed by the Turks were able to capture Sarakib is that Sarakib was captured by the Syrian army at an earlier stage in this offensive. The Syrian army then relocated some of its best troops from Sarakib to another part of Idlib province. The troops who were sent to garrison Sarakib in the meantime were lower grade troops, and they were not up to stand. They weren't able to stand up to the Turkish organized and Turkish backed counterattack which has recaptured this town. Now that shows again that there are some very proficient Syrian military units, but they're not everywhere, and that some parts of the Syrian army are simply not up to fighting even, militia groups, jihadi militia groups by themselves. Also, one has to say this. I mean, the Turkish army is much bigger and much better armed and equipped than the Syrian army is. I mean, there's no comparison. The Turks, of course, can't fight the Russians. They can perhaps defeat the Syrians, but they can't defeat the Russians.
Well, that's my point. If they go up against the Syrians, they're going up against the Russians. Is
Correct.
there no doubt that if Turkey does decide to fight Syria, Russia will back Syria, correct?
Yes, they said so. They have repeatedly said so. They've, in fact, been issuing a stream of comments over the last few weeks as the Turks have become increasingly belligerent or confrontational about this crisis. And they've issued more statements like that over the course of today. What they're basically saying is the Syrian army is acting entirely legitimately in going after terrorists in Idlib province. Putin said this to Erdogan in a telephone call they had yesterday. And the implication of that is a very clear implication of that is that Russia will continue to back the Syrian army, and that means it will provide the Syrian army with its full backing. I would add.
What does that mean, full backing, Alexander? Does that mean that Russia gets involved in going head to head with Turkey? Should something happen? I don't think it will escalate, my own personal opinion.
Yes.
But should it happen, does that mean that essentially you're looking at Russia v. Turkey?
Yes, I think in that situation it would. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. The Russian Air Force controls the skies over Idlib province. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that any entry by the Turkish Air Force into Idlib province will not be tolerated, and any Turkish aircraft that go into Idlib province will be shot down. The Turks apparently tried to get the Russians to agree to allow some Turkish aircraft to fly over Idlib province, but the Russians refused to permit this. There are Turkish drones operating over Idlib province, and if you believe some of the reports that have been pouring out in Turkey, some of those drones are armed and have carried out airstrikes, though this is questioned both in Russia and in Syria. But manned Turkish aircraft are not allowed there, and if the Turkish military attacks the Syrian military in Idlib, it will face the full force of the Russian Air Force.
Okay, Alexander, I titled this live stream Erdogan Unhinged because to me it seems that Erdogan's making a lot of multi-pronged moves
Yes.
that I don't know if he's really thought them out so well, but
Yes.
they seem to me like they're pretty destructive moves.
Yes.
You mentioned, of course, what's going on between Russia. There's also the migrants that he started to flood into Europe. And he tried to invoke Article 5. From what I understand, he was politely rejected.
Yes.
But the US is, of course, going to play this card on a diplomatic level. I doubt they're going to get involved once again on a military level, but they are going to play this from a diplomatic level to welcome Turkey back on side with NATO and the West, because over the past, I would say maybe 3 years, 2-3 years, I think Russia has played the diplomatic card of trying to woo Turkey away from NATO. And I've always said in many streams that that was a failed policy on Russia's part.
Yes.
It wasn't going to happen.
Yes.
Because I see here in Greece and also see in Cyprus that everyone's saying, okay, now we can side with the US, Turkey can side with Russia. This is all great. I tell the Greeks and the Cypriots, don't fool yourselves. Turkey will always side with the US, no matter what. And the US will always choose Turkey over every country, maybe bar Germany, every country in Europe. They will always, or in NATO, they will always choose Turkey. Turkey is the most valuable NATO member to the United States. They're not going to let them go. So, Alexander, all the moves that Erdogan is making, do you see them as reckless? Do you see them as calculated? What's your opinion on a wider geopolitical level, the migrants, NATO, Article 5, all these things?
Let's talk first of all about the practical moves, because of course what has happened is that he's now, Erdogan has lost 34 of his troops. There's a major crisis within Turkey itself. There's divisions of opinion there. There's a lot of Turkish people who are very angry with Syria and Russia and want to see the Turkish government, the Turkish army acting resolutely against the Russians and the Syrians. Erdogan knows he can't take on the Russians by himself. At the same time, there are other people in Turkey in the opposition who are saying, Turkey can't afford to go into war with Russia in Syria, and really Turkey shouldn't be in Syria at all. So he's got all those pressures. He's also losing men. He's losing men in Idlib province. And it's important to remember that the Turkish military is still conscript based. Not the entire Turkish army is conscript based, but there are conscripts. Turkish conscripts serve in the Turkish military. So if large numbers of Turkish soldiers get killed, that increases the political pressure on Erdogan. So he has been trying to gain leverage over the Russians in order to try to both preserve his position in Idlib province and at the same time not put at risk large numbers of Turkish soldiers and lead the Turkish army to a potentially catastrophic defeat. So he's been trying to leverage, to apply leverage where he can with NATO. So on the one hand, he's talked to the Americans about getting Patriot missiles stationed along the Turkish border to interfere with Russian control of Syrian airspace. It seems the US has refused. The US has said they're not going to do that because, of course, the US doesn't want to get involved in a crisis to transit Turkey to go to Europe. He knows perfectly well how sensitive an issue that is for the Europeans, for Germany specifically, for Angela Merkel especially. And he also knows, that with the coronavirus raging, and you mentioned earlier about how it's now very widespread in Iran, and it may be spreading across the Middle East. It's going to be a very sensitive issue for the Europeans. But what happened was that there was a NATO meeting today. The NATO meeting came away with words of support and sympathy for Turkey and for the Turkish military, but no words, no suggestion of concrete support. And in fact, I know one NATO government, which is Luxembourg, which sometimes speaks for Germany, is used by the Germans to express their views. They made it very clear that there will be no NATO involvement in Idlib. So it looks as if Erdogan is on his own in Idlib province. So that has exposed him, I think, to the limits of Western support for him. But of course, what he's also learned, and what we've got to also understand, this goes back to what you are saying, is that this relationship that existed between Russia and Turkey over the last 3 years is in so many ways an unnatural one. If you look at the history of Russian-Turkish policies and relationships, it has most often been very hostile. They fought each other, as a Turkish official said today, 16 times. They've had, 16 times they fought wars. Turkey has often been a very strongly anti-Russian country. And as you rightly say, it is a pivotal member of NATO. And in terms of Syria, Turkey and Russia are on opposite sides. So what Erdogan has realized, what has discovered, is that yes, there are limits to the support he will get from NATO in these kind of confrontations. But ultimately, this relationship he has with the Russians can't deliver for him all the things he perhaps expected or wanted, because Russian-Turkish partnership is ultimately a partnership of opposites and is incompatible. So he's now caught between, in a sense, the two realities. The reality that he can't get NATO support for this extravagantly overambitious foreign policy that he's had, but also the reality that an alliance with Russia is simply not an option for Turkey, and that perhaps for Turkey, ultimately, the reality has to be that it stays within NATO. I don't think he's ever planned to leave NATO. I don't think he's ever planned to break with the United States, but I think he now realizes, perhaps better than he did a few weeks ago, that ultimately it is with NATO and the West that his interests lie.
Alexander, when you started this live stream, when you gave the intro to it, you mentioned the word failed Russian diplomacy. I think that's one of the first times I've actually heard you say failed Russian diplomacy. You've always praised Russian diplomacy.
Yes.
Why do you think it's failed, number one?
Yeah.
And number two, I mean, we've talked a lot how Russia may have put too much trust into how it could woo Turkey away from NATO and how it could work with Turkey to bring peace to Syria. But why do you think Russian diplomacy has failed, number one? And number two, I was messaging you in WhatsApp and I threw a very far-fetched theory out there, very far-fetched. When was the plane shot down, the Sioux?
In 2015.
Okay, 2015. Do you think Russia has ever forgotten that? Do you think Putin has ever forgotten that incident?
No.
Number one. Do you think that this is now stay with me, some sort of master chess move, master judo move on the part of Putin, where he knew, okay, I'll try to get Turkey on side, but if I don't, I will use Erdogan's unpredictable manner against him and put him in a situation where he really is isolated. And Europe, US, and Russia kind of all want to see Erdogan fade away and go. And that, to me, may be an outside possibility as to where this is heading. And Erdogan may be panicking here, because all these moves that he's making seems like they're moves out of panic.
Yes.
But no one is really supporting him. Yeah, the US is saying, you know, we're behind you, and Europe is trying to figure things out. Russia's keeping a firm line. It seems that maybe Putin and Russia may have maneuvered Erdogan into this position, kind of using his own weight against him, if I can take, you know, like a judo type of maneuver.
Which is, of course, the sport that Putin excels in. In fact, apparently he was an Olympic standard at this. I think this is too, I think that I understand that theory. I've actually seen variations of it being discussed. I think it's a bit I don't think it's quite as complicated or as intricate as that. Firstly, I don't think Putin has ever forgotten the shooting down by the Turks of the Russian Sukhoi 24 bomber in November 2015. I don't think he's ever forgotten it. He's not the kind of man who forgets these things. He's not the kind of man who forgives these things. I don't think he's ever had particularly warm feelings towards Erdogan. I think what Putin has calculated over the last 3 years is that, yes, Russia can extract quite a lot of benefits from increasing its trade and its connections with Turkey, and would like to the extent that it can, to draw Turkey away from NATO and into the orbit of the Eurasian powers, Russia and China. At the same time, he's also, I think, understood that it suits Russia's interests to keep a good dialogue with Erdogan, to prevent Turkey from interfering further in the stabilization of Syria, which has been Russia's overriding priority. So they didn't want the Turks interfering, for example, in the Battle of Aleppo that took place in 2016. They didn't want the Turks supporting ISIS, which it had done in a kind of crypto way, whilst the Syrian army was marching eastward towards Deir ez-Zor and was securing control of central and eastern Turkey, Syria. But he didn't want the Turks involved in those things. And I think he thought that he could eventually get Erdogan to see things in a, as the Russians would say, rational way. So the Russians are always very realistic people, and realize that ultimately this adventure that Erdogan has launched himself into in Syria wasn't ever going to achieve anything positive for Turkey, and that Turkey's interests lay in a strong Syrian government in Damascus, regaining full control of Syria, including the Kurdish areas. Now, that is a very Russian way of thinking. And of course, the great mistake the Russians always make is that they consistently overestimate the realism of the people they deal with. The Russians themselves tend to be very hard-headed, very pragmatic in their approach to things. They don't fully, I think, understand what, you know, that anger, emotion, pride can get in the way of the way people act. And I think that Putin's big mistake with Erdogan was, I think he thought when he did this deal with Erdogan in Sochi in December 2018, that he was getting Erdogan to commit to a long-term process which would result in the eventual stabilization of Syria. Whereas I think Erdogan saw this in a completely different way. I think he interpreted the Russian agreement to a Turkish role in establishing this de-escalation zone in Idlib as a Russian green light to the establishment of a permanent Turkish protectorate in Idlib and in certain other regions of northern Syria, like Afrin, another region called Afrin, a region called Jarablus, and of course some areas that were formerly occupied by the Kurds. So I think that the Russians didn't make themselves to Erdogan in clear, and I think he came away with the wrong ideas, and I think the Russians also came away with the wrong ideas, and that this has set up the situation for this crisis that we see now. There was, I think neither side was reading the other clearly, because for Erdogan, it's quite clear now that he does have a visceral commitment both to the opposition in Syria and to the need to hold on to these areas of northern Syria, Afrin, Idlib, the Jarablus corridor, and of course the areas along the border between Turkey and the Kurds. And also, I think long term, I think Erdogan still feels that Syria should belong in some way or form within a Turkish sphere of influence. So I think there was this basic misunderstanding, and that's where it went wrong. Now, what you suggested, that the Russians have basically lured Erdogan into a situation where he is in a no-win situation, I think that is what has happened. I think that's where we are, in effect, because, as you said rightly, Erdogan now finds himself in a situation where if he moves forward, he doesn't have NATO behind him, and he's left facing the Russians by himself, which is a terrible position to be in. But I don't think that this was something that the Russians set out intentionally to do. I think it's a miscalculation rather than the result of a plan. That's my view.
Maybe it was a well-planned miscalculation in that once they stabilized Syria enough, they kind of game planned all the risks, and they said, okay, the worst case scenario is what's playing out now.
Yes.
And Russia and Putin and his team and Lavrov realized that if we get to this worst case scenario, we still have all the leverage, knowing where Europe and the US and NATO will fall. They knew what was going to happen, and knowing the character of Erdogan, because they've dealt with him pretty much on a weekly basis. I mean, they're having calls all the time. You've documented how often they're speaking. So they knew that we might end up at this point, but let's keep Erdogan with us until we stabilize the situation as a whole. Yes. We'll have Idlib left over. But once we have that situation stabilized and we have Syria at, say, 95%, if we end up going down this worst case scenario, this path of the worst case scenario, then at least we'll be able to manage it and to have leverage over Erdogan. And if he messes up, then we can cut him loose. And we know that Europe doesn't have much of an appetite for Erdogan. We know Macron, you mentioned it, Macron doesn't have much of an appetite to deal with Erdogan. I think pretty much it's safe to say that they absolutely hate each other.
Correct.
I think Merkel isn't too fond of Erdogan either, even though Merkel's appeased him at every step. She's appeased him. And we know that Trump isn't too hot on Erdogan either. Trump would definitely like to see a different type of Turkey aligned with the US, always aligned with the US, but a different type of Turkey. So maybe the Russians had a sense that it could go this way, and it's okay if it goes this way, as long as they've stabilized most of Syria. And now they can really, tell Erdogan, look, either you work with us, or we're just going to cut you loose, man, and we're just going to leave you to your own devices. At that point in time, you're toast. And let's not forget, the economy is not doing very well.
No.
And I think it was, I forgot which user it was. God, I forgot. But you mentioned the Russian ambassador as well. They may have never forgotten what happened to the Russian ambassador.
No, absolutely not.
Well,
correct. That's all.
I think it was idiosyncratic user. I'm not sure, but anyway, great point there on the live chat.
All of that is entirely true. I mean, I've never got the sense actually that the Putin, as I said, has any very great warm feelings for Erdogan. In fact, one of the extraordinary things about this whole relationship between Putin and Erdogan is, as you rightly say, they speak almost every week. I mean, it's just unbelievable if you go to the Russian presidential website. every other week, it's every week you see Erdogan suddenly cropping up and calling Putin, and one gets the impression that Putin must be absolutely exhausted and fed up with all of these endless conversations he has with Erdogan, which overwhelmingly, by the way, are at Erdogan's insistence, and he's gone along with it. So, I put it the way you've just done, the Russians, having got to this point where basically they hold all the cards, are perfectly willing to cut off Erdogan rather than, continue to appease him. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the Russians saw back in 2015, at the time of the Su-24 crisis, as I say, when Erdogan, when the Turkish Air Force shot down that Russian aircraft, that at that time, Erdogan wasn't able to get support from NATO. And I think the Russians understand how limited the support for Erdogan in NATO is. And I think, they're perfectly aware of the strength of their own position. And they will be pointing this out, by the way, in their own, very discreet way to Erdogan, that, you're not really in a position to take us on. It's much more in your interests to back down. Apparently, they've offered him a proposal, which is that the Turkish forces pull back from the regions of Idlib, which are still contested, and establish a corridor, another sort of safe zone along the border, but that the rest of Idlib basically is brought back under Syrian government control. So they're not pushing him to the point where he's left with nothing, but they are very conscious of the strength of their position and of the weakness of Erdogan's position. So that's, I think, where we stand with this. And ultimately, if it involves a Turkish army marching into Idlib and being defeated by the Russians, well, they'll do it. I mean, I think they've made it absolutely clear that they're prepared to do that, and they will.
Yeah, Russia made it clear when they entered into Syria that they mean business. So
absolutely, well, they have. They've shown that repeatedly. They've been absolutely prepared to fight. And by the way, they've made warnings, which is a fact people constantly ignore or misunderstand. They have repeatedly warned the US that if the US attacks Russian military bases and Russian troops in Syria, not Russian mercenaries, a different story, but the major military bases and troops in Syria, then the Russians will react militarily to those attacks. And the US has heeded those calls, and Erdogan would be utterly reckless if he didn't.
No, I agree. I bet you that Trump is speaking with Putin about all of this. That's my sense. Simon Coates says Greece has now closed all their borders. I've actually heard that too, that Greece is not going to let these refugees from Turkey enter their borders. Interestingly enough, though, Alexander, there are a lot of protests going on in Greece about building more detention centers on the islands. So that would be political suicide for Greece to actually let Erdogan flood Greece with more refugees into Greece. So that's not going to happen. So Greece has reacted, and it is the right move from a political level or from a domestic level. They are not going to allow anyone into the country. Interesting timing, everything that's going on in Greece with the protests against the refugees and this move by Erdogan, and it's hit a wall in Greece as well. So they're not going to allow anyone in. Thank you, Simon, for that news as well. Real quick, Alexander, before we get to super chats, what goes on with the S-400s now?
Yes, well, this is of course the major thing, because Erdogan still has got those S-400s. They're not yet in full operation. They're being commissioned. Apparently, that's going on. They're still there, obviously, but of course, there must be some people in Moscow who are worrying now that if there is a major falling out with Turkey, then the S-400 missiles will eventually end up in American hands and be compromised. That was, that's something where the Russians may ultimately regret that they rushed to supply Turkey with these very sophisticated systems. But there we are. I mean, we are where we are. the Russians made that decision. It worked for them diplomatically and politically for a while. It did create problems between Turkey and the United States. But if it means that that system is compromised, I mean, you know, that will be.
Can't you make the assumption, Alexander, that they knew that from the beginning, that the minute they supplied S-400s to Turkey, even if they had stellar relationship between the two, Russia and Turkey, and they were buddies, Erdogan and Putin, that the US would compromise those S-400s? I mean, that's a given, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, I can tell you for a fact that they did, because I've read endless numbers of commentaries in the English language Russian media, which has made precisely this point. That sale of S-400 missiles to Turkey was not uncontroversial in Russia. Lots of people in Russia said...
Why did they do it?
Well, because, as I said, they thought that it would create problems between the US and Turkey at a time when it was in Russia's interests to create those problems, because, as I said, they were trying to keep the Turks from meddling in Syria, and were, I think, generally hoping that they could build a long-term relationship with Syria. What I would say is that there are, I am pretty sure that these S-400 missiles that the Turks have are not the most advanced variant of this system. I mean, there will be particular elements of that system which will not have been supplied to the Turks and which the Turks will not possess. So it will continue to be, there will be continue to be secrets involving it, and there will be elements of it which the Americans will not have access to. So having said that, even if it's a less advanced version of the system, it would still provide the Americans with a great deal of insight into how it operates, if they were able to get their hands on it. So the Russians took that risk. They made that decision. They may end up regretting it, but there we are. I think that they've decided now that if that's going to happen, it happens. And there are plenty of other advanced Russian air defense systems coming on stream, which will supersede the S-400. There's a new one, by the way, the S-350, which has just entered service. And there's the even more advanced, the apparently phenomenally advanced S-500, which is apparently just a short time from entering service also.
Yeah, I would imagine that the U.S. must know how the S-400s,
well,
S-400s tick by now. I would imagine.
Well, they will know a great deal,
yeah,
because they will have monitored how the Russians operated in Syria. Remember, the S-400 is in Syria, stationed in Syria, and they will have seen how it operates and the kind of things that it does. Apparently, the Russians and the Americans have learned a great deal about each other and about their respective weapon systems and about the quality of their troops from the fact that they've been facing off in Syria for the last couple of years. So apparently the Russians have learned a lot, for example, about how the F-22, America's premier stealth fighter, how it works. The Americans have learned quite a lot about the Su-35, which is the most advanced Russian fighter, which the Russians have deployed to Syria, and apparently were surprised at how effective it was, even though it's not a stealth aircraft. And of course, the Americans would have learnt a lot about the S-400 simply through having to work around it.
All right, let's get to the super chats. Alexander, is there anything else you'd like to add before I get to super chats?
Well, as I said, we are going to see this meeting. I just want to say that this meeting now is apparently on the cards between Putin and Erdogan. Now, Erdogan was trying to arrange a meeting with Putin in Istanbul, and he was going to bring Merkel and Macron along. And Putin would have none of it, apparently. He absolutely refused to go to Istanbul. He even got his spokesman to say that he was busy on the day that was proposed, and apparently he didn't want to see Merkel and Macron there. So instead, we're going to have Erdogan going to Moscow instead, and I think that shows where the balance of power in this relationship lies. Putin has the stronger cards, and Erdogan knows it. Now, what Erdogan is going to do and what kind of mood he's going to be in going to Moscow, we will see.
Was the date announced?
It's not yet announced,
Okay.
but it will probably be either the 5th or the 6th of March.
Okay, great. All right, let's get to super chats. Thank you, Spartan Warrior Queen, for helping me out in the moderation. You're doing a great job. I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. Let's get to some super chats. Alexander from Peter Milne, finally caught you from the South Pacific, New Zealand Patreon. I would love you men to do a vid on all the influence that the USA has had in affecting, interfering, backing, oppositions, etc. in other countries over the past decades, +1.
Well, indeed, we will certainly try and do that. I mean, we are very much a channel which is strongly opposed to all this kind of foreign meddling that the US does and the way it supports what it calls opposition groups, which of course in most cases are just American Trojan horses in these various countries.
And Peter sent another super chat continuing on the first one, perhaps putting into perspective the minimal interference that the likes of Russia has done in the past compared to them. I think you'd be busy for at least an hour.
Oh,
that would be a 2 or 3 part video.
We certainly would, and let's definitely do it, because in fact there is a fundamental difference in relationship. We hear all about Russian meddling at the moment in US elections and Russian meddling in Brexit referendums and all that sort of thing, which is, while not just exaggerated, it's essentially non-existent. And the contrast with the US, which meddles and considers that it has the right to meddle in everything, is remarkable. Though I just was reading, by the way, just before we did this program, a extraordinary article in Foreign Affairs, which is one of the big American establishment, entirely mainstream, foreign affairs magazines, very close to the State Department, which actually goes with the title. It's time to arrange for more regime change in Iraq. Well, regime change in Iraq didn't turn out very well before.
The third time around.
They're going to try again. I mean, it's quite amazing to read this sort of stuff, but there it is.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And we're glad that you're joining us from New Zealand, and our best to everyone in New Zealand. I'm looking at the live stream from Michael Alexander. If war or total downgrade of relations between Turkey and Russia occur to the point of military confrontation, can't Russia use its cruise and ballistic missiles to destroy the Turks' S-300s?
Yes, absolutely.
Can't they switch them off as well? I mean,
they can to some extent. As I said, I think without Russian cooperation, remember these things are not even operating at the moment. Without Russian cooperation, I don't think the Turks would be able to operate them. But that's not the problem. The problem is not whether they would be operated, it's whether they'd be shipped to the United States, to Washington State, and
to Langley or to Texas somewhere. Yeah,
exactly. I mean that for the Russians would be the real concern. Not to think that these weapons would be used against them, but that the American that whatever secrets these weapons have would be compromised.
Okay, from Simon Coates, £5 super chat. Erdogan, quote, the minarets are our bayonets, the mosques are our barracks, the believers are our soldiers, end quotes. That was a quote from Erdogan.
It is indeed, and I think it puts the finger, and I use a very valuable quote, on what drives this man. I mean, I think there's a sort of complacency on the part of many people, including the Russians, about Erdogan's, Islamism. I think it's entirely genuine. This man believes in all of this. And of course, those are the forces that he talks about, the minarets, the mosques. They are his support base in Turkey itself. Lots of people in Turkey are very, very devout Muslims, and they identify with a president who they see as a devout Muslim and who is pursuing in the Middle East a policy which on the one hand is Turkish nationalist, but on the other hand also seeks to position Turkey as the great Sunni Muslim power.
All right,
so this is an important factor.
An important quote. Thank you, Simon, for that contribution. And from Gleska News, thanks, guys. Can you tell us anything about the oil fields that the U.S. seems to have captured? Are they pumping oil, etc.? That's a £20 super chat from Gleska News. And once again, check out their YouTube channel, Gleska News. Alexander, the oil fields.
Yes, as I understand it, there's no actual oil in any quantity being pumped from there. But of course, the purpose of the US controlling those oil fields is not to have, to take the oil from them, which is not going to be consequential for an economy the size of the US. I mean, so people who talk about this as an act of plunder are misunderstanding this. The purpose of the US act occupying those oil fields is to deny Syria its own oil. And of course, for an economy like Syria's, which is relatively small anyway, and has now been shattered by war, losing one of its most important assets, which is its oil fields, has been a major blow. In addition, the US has been trying to restrict supply of oil to Syria from Iran. And in fact, over the course of last year, Syria was faced with a very severe oil shortage because it didn't have access to its own oil, and it was struggling to get oil from Iran. Apparently that has abated, and the assumption is that quietly the Russians have been providing Syria with oil instead. So it's a major destabilizing factor for Syria. It should be understood as an aggressive action by the United States directed at Syria in order to prevent the Syrian government from stabilizing and consolidating its control of the country, and in order to keep the conflict in Syria ongoing.
Okay, thank you for that super chat, Gleska News. Life of Brian, $22 super chat. Huge fan. Thank you guys. My dad loved Agonia. I don't usually get to appreciate because I usually play these after airing at 1.75 speed because Mercuris' penetrating analysis and deliberate pacing of speech. Thank you, Life of Brian. We are happy to have you here on this live stream, Alexander.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. I'm delighted also that your dad enjoyed Agonia. I mean, it is an extraordinary film, I think.
All right. Thank you very much, Life of Brian. Vash the Stampede, $2 super chat. Is Turkey going to get Russia and NATO into a war?
No, I think, as I said already, I think the Europeans are absolutely determined that they will stay out of this. And I think the US military has no desire to get into a shooting war with the Russians in Syria. They've repeatedly shown that they don't want to get drawn into a war like that. But what the US will do, and is doing, is it's trying to leverage this conflict that has now grown up over Idlib between Russia and Turkey to pull Turkey back towards NATO and away from Russia.
As they should.
As they should.
It's the predictable move, yeah.
It's not only the predictable move, I predict that to a certain extent they will succeed, because ultimately it's the more natural alliance. Turkey and Russia have always had difficult relations. There have been short periods of time, as was the case under Kemal Atatürk in the 20s and early 30s, when they were friends, and under Erdogan they've been sort of friends. But it's never continued for very long, because there are too many things that pull the two countries away from each other.
Okay. Super chat from Valies, $20 super chat. Thank you, Valies. As always, thank you, Valies, for your super chat and your support. From Rainy Steps, a super chat. Are there Iranian troops helping Syrian troops?
Well, I'm sure there are, probably more in the form of special forces. And I would have thought that the Iranians also are providing the usual forms of intelligence that the Iranians are very skilled at doing in this area. It's barely visible. And the overarching duel at the moment in Idlib is between Russia and Turkey, but I'm sure the Iranians are there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rainy Steps, for that super chat. From Sparky, a $5 super chat. Remind Trump voters to vote Tulsi in SC primary. Trump doesn't need them, and Tulsi needs a boost. They can still vote Trump in the general. Hashtag free Assange.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I should say that I was with George Galloway and Craig Murray and Eva Bartlett, and of course our very own Peter Lavelle at a talk in London in which we were supporting Julian Assange. And as the Duran, we've been covering that trial, if it can be called a trial. I don't know whether it can be called a trial, as thoroughly as we possibly can. In the face, by the way, of a lot of pressure, because YouTube doesn't like us doing it.
Thank you, Sparky, for that super chat. I saw an interview with Tulsi just before we went live on Fox News, and she says she's still in the race. So don't count her out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. From Moondragon, SEK 50. Russia seems willing to go far for Syria. Why do you think is the true reason for this?
That's a very good question, because I should say that back in 2015, when the Russians intervened in Syria, when it turned out that the Russian Air Force had gone to Syria, there was quite a lot of unease about it in Russia. A lot of people in Russia were very, very uncertain whether, this is really something that Russia should be involved in. I mean, there's no great emotional feelings in Russia about Syria. I think the reason that they went to Syria was basically twofold. Firstly, Syria is a long-standing ally and friend of Russia's. I mean, they've established good relations with the Syrians way back in the 60s. Syria has been one of the few Arab countries that has been consistently friendly to Russia throughout that period. And of course, the Russians did have a small naval facility there. It wasn't really a base, it's more a repair facility, but it was a symbol that Russia still had a kind of presence in the Middle East. But I think the major overriding reason why the Russians went to Syria and why they've gone to all these tremendous risks in Syria, you have to understand what happened in Russia in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when they saw violent jihadi movements, Al-Qaeda in effect, entrench themselves in the Caucasus, in Russian territory, waging a jihad against Russia. And that included terrorist attacks in Moscow, on the Moscow metro. Actually, I was actually in Moscow when one of those happened. I was in Moscow, by the way, when the Beslan school siege happened. And I think the Russians looked at this and they said to themselves, we cannot tolerate a situation where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS entrench themselves in Syria, which is so close to Russia's own territory. And that was just a red line that the Russians were not prepared to allow that it be crossed. And I would add that in 2015, in the summer of 2015, when the decision to intervene in Syria was made, it looked as if the Syrian government was on the brink of total collapse. Barack Obama was talking about establishing a no-fly zone over Syria, which we all know what that means. It would have been a bombing campaign. ISIS was in Palmyra, not far from Damascus, and apparently the Russians were told by European diplomats that they were expecting that by December 2015, the black flags of ISIS would be flying over Damascus, which was once the capital of the Muslim Caliphate. So the Russians, when they heard all that, they said, absolutely not. We can't possibly even consider such a thing. And they intervened decisively to prevent it. From that moment on, the Russians have looked for ways, for partners, to try to stabilize Syria. They've tried with the Americans, they've tried with the Turks. I think they've gradually come round to the view that Bashar al-Assad is the only game in town. And that's why they've increasingly come round to giving him their full and unequivocal backing.
Yep, very good points, Alexander. People always forget how close ISIS was to overtaking Damascus.
Yes.
15 kilometers away.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much for that super chat, Moondragon. From David Lee, a £2 super chat. Thank you, David, for that super chat. We appreciate it. From Merwin, a €5 super chat. Keep it up. Thank you very much, Merwin, for that super chat as well. From Sparky, despite greater culture differences, then with some questionable allies. There was never any question. Turkey was our ally when I was in the US Army.
Well, true. There we are. I mean, and I think that's right. I mean, the Turkish-US alliance goes back very far now. I mean, goes back to the 1940s. That's a long, historic, and very close relationship. And I'd add something else. If we're talking about, Americans feeling that the Turks were allies, the Turkish military has been built up around the alliance with the United States. And of course, that still counts for an awful lot in Turkey. And I think that is absolutely an operative fact to this day. Erdogan has had issues with the United States at various times. Erdogan has issues with everybody. I mean, he falls out with everybody sooner or later. But if you're talking about the underlying realities, Turkey and the US have always found common ground. Turkey and Russia, on balance, have not.
Okay, thank you very much, Sparky, for that super chat and that insight as well when you were in the US Army. And another super chat from Sparky: advised President Trump to ask his voters to vote Tulsi in the primary to break it off in the establishment. 1/2 of the states have open primaries. Super Tuesday, a lot of voting going on. And
well, indeed.
Vote Tulsi.
I will say straight away, I mean, if Tulsi would certainly be getting my vote if I was an American citizen, which I, of course, am not. I'm talking about the primaries now, not the general election.
Okay, thank you very much, Sparky, for that. From David Lee, another super chat, £2 super chat. Thank you, David Lee, for your support. From Brian O'Callaghan, a €10 super chat. Thank you very much, Brian, for that super chat and your support. From Toilet Sauce, a €10 super chat. Part 1. Alex, your theory may not be that far-fetched. Remember, Putin is a judo practitioner. He is likely to use his opponent's move and momentum against himself. Part 2, Alexander, from his perspective, either he establishes good relations with Turkey, which works for him, or Turkey becomes isolated because no one trusts it in Europe, which also works for Putin. Toilet Sauce, you said it better than I could have ever said it. Alexander, what do you make of those two super chats?
He said it brilliantly. I mean, at the end of the day, whatever one thinks about what's happened between Russia and Turkey over the last 4 years, since they repaired their relationships, I mean, the Russians have gained quite a lot. I mean, Erdogan has lost goodwill in Europe and the United States. He's become much more isolated than he was. He's also been exposed, as I said, to the limits of Western support for him. So Turkey is weakened and isolated if it goes against Russia. And of course, if it patches things up with Russia, well, Russia gains even better. So, I think Toilet Sauce has put it brilliantly.
Yeah, very well said. From Flying Boar, a $5 Canadian super chat. I told you that you can't trust Erdogan. Russia should have started their operations in Idlib during 2018. A lot of people have made the point that Russia should have started operations much earlier.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very fair point. The Russians, I think, waited through 2019 to see whether Erdogan would deliver, and he didn't. And they gave him a whole year, and maybe they shouldn't have, actually. And I think the fact that they gave him the whole year may have made Erdogan himself more complacent and strengthened, reinforced his belief that the Russians had actually quietly ceded Idlib to him, which of course they hadn't done. So, sometimes there's a very famous quote from Machiavelli, the Prince, in which Machiavelli says that you should never put off a battle which you have to fight, because if you do, you invariably do so to your own disadvantage. So there we are.
Sure. All right. Thank you for that super chat. And from Sparky, a $5 super chat. Tulsi doing better can help Trump from listening to Haspel and Pompeo, who've manipulated him against Assange and toward military intervention. There's no doubt that a Tulsi is a game changer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's why the mainstream media and the establishment have frozen her out, or have tried to freeze her out. So, she deserves to get every vote and all the support that she can, and I hope she does.
And she's a game changer when it comes to foreign policy, which is important to note because no Democrats are really talking about foreign policy, the existing candidates right now. So thank you very much, Sparky, for that super chat. And another super chat from Sparky. America loves Greeks, Greece, and Greek culture. But as far as military alliances go, they go for Turkey. No offense, fellas. No offense taken. We know this.
We know this. We've lived it. We've lived it. We've lived it. So we know it very well.
Yeah, we've lived it in Greece. We've lived it in Cyprus. We've lived it intimately in Cyprus with Turkey. So thank you very much, Sparky, for that super chat. I will say that Greeks do have a very favorable feeling towards Russia as well. I think they actually pull the highest when it comes to the favorability towards Russia.
Yes.
And towards Putin, but Greeks also love America as well. And there's a very large Greek diaspora in the US as well. And I love America and I love Russia as well. So you can love both nations.
Completely agree.
All right. From Flying Boar, why not Erdogan can take these fighters at Idlib and take them to Libya?
Well, he has.
He's doing it.
He took quite a lot of them to Libya, and I think that may also have caused misunderstandings. I think there may have been a belief in Moscow that he was actually quietly removing them all from Idlib and taking them to Libya, so that in preparation for letting the Syrian army go into Idlib province. It's turned out, of course, that wasn't correct, and that in fact that wasn't Erdogan's plan at all. So there we go. But I mean, that's certainly an option that he still has. I think what Erdogan needs to do is he needs to sit back and think very carefully about where he's got himself into, and he's also got to be very careful that he doesn't lose control of the situation, because as Alex said right at the start of the program, he is playing in all sorts of places. He's unhinged. He is playing with the Europeans. He's playing with the Americans. He's playing with the Russians. He's playing a very dangerous game in Idlib province. He's stirred up people, made people very angry in Turkey itself with the Russians. Many of these people will be pushing him into a confrontation. He's got also other people in Turkey who are very angry with him because he's getting into this confrontation. He's very, very close to losing control. And I hope that the fact that he's now agreed to go to Russia to see Putin there is a sign that he's grasped this and is going to start pulling back. But we shall have to see. A volatile, unpredictable, and indeed untrustworthy man.
All right, a super chat from Megawit, 10 euro super chat from Megawit. Thank you very much. And from Sparky, Turkey buying Russian equipment shouldn't be a problem. India bought many MiG-21s, no question about whose side India's on as far as it matters.
Yes,
good point.
Well, that's a very good point, actually. And we have been thinking, by the way, about doing a video on Trump in India, because it's a subject that we can talk about. We can talk about further. It's a very good point.
Very good point, Sparky. And another super chat from Sparky. When you speak with Trump, plant the seed that he asked his voters to vote Tulsi in a primary. They're free to vote Trump in the general. Free Assange.
Well, there we go. Yes, hashtag. Yes.
No, we're in agreement, Sparky. Absolutely.
We agree.
All right. From
I'll view entirely.
Yeah, from Fabutabi, a $5 super chat. Thank you very much for that super chat. From Antonia, £1.99. Britain has history in foreign meddling too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, the British are on a vast scale, and of course they do it still. I mean, they've been very involved in Syria, by the way. I went to a event in the House of Commons on the OPCW scandal. We covered it in a video, and it was very striking. I mean, there was a British officer there, and we heard all kinds of things about the involvement of particular British people, British military officers in Syria. James Le Mesurier, who was a British officer, was the founder of the White Helmets. So yes, the British do meddle in all sorts of places. They have their fingers in many pies. They were at the forefront of the NATO war against Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. And of course, they were also very heavily involved in the war against Yugoslavia. These are just the recent events. And of course, Tony Blair was in Iraq with Saddam Hussein.
And never forget that all the money is in the city of London.
Indeed, so. I would say a lot of British people of every political opinion, left, right, Labour, Conservative, are deeply opposed to these policies and would not want to see Britain directly involved in another war in the Middle East. So we need to be as aware of that too. Doesn't always get very articulated, and you wouldn't know about it from reading our newspapers. But this propensity by the British establishment to meddle in other countries is not shared by the majority of the British people. Of that, I'm sure.
Okay. From Flying Boar, $5 super chat. Erdogan sure knows how to make enemies. He's angered the Russians, China, US, EU, and now siding with Pakistan against India over Kashmir. Excellent point.
Very good point. I mean, he's consistently overestimates Turkey's power. He doesn't have a realistic understanding of the limits of what Turkey's power is. So he can be very skilled tactically, and he can be very, very disastrously incompetent strategically. I've said very hard things about the Russians and the miscalculations they made with Erdogan. But we must also remember that the bigger miscalculations in this have been made by Erdogan himself. He is looking in Idlib at what is starting to look like a no-win situation for him. And that's not a good position to be in.
No, it's not. Okay, the Sin of Pride super chat 100 and okay. Thoughts on Stoltenberg, my former prime minister?
Indeed,
he gave a lukewarm.
Very lukewarm statement. Of course, he's a passionate supporter of NATO and somebody who doesn't come across to me as liking the Russians at all. But the very lukewarm statement that he made strongly, reinforces my view that Erdogan is on his own in this one.
Okay, from Sparky, $5 super chat. Trump voters should send Trump an anti-intervention and pro-Assange message. Vote Tulsi in a primary. Use Trump's millions of unneeded primary voters.
Correct. Entirely agree.
That would be a shock to the system if they all went out and voted Tulsi.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because it's the super delegates, Alexander. So
correct.
A lot of all this is theater.
Oh, well, true. But I mean, I think if Tulsi was to win a primary somewhere, which isn't going to happen. But I mean,
that would send a shock. But I'm saying overall, the general Democratic campaign at the end of the day will come down to the super delegates.
I agree with that. I mean, I would also say that with the way the election has been going, the primaries have been going at the moment, even if she did win a primary, they'd probably count the votes to say that she didn't. But there we go.
Tulsi voting app,
but I have to say, all the same, people should go out and vote for her and support her. She's a remarkable and brave person, and she deserves support. And I completely agree with her foreign policy positions, which in this election are far and away the best ones.
Okay, from Valhalla, Bright Hall Seminole Strategics, a €10 super chat. Thank you. Thank you, Valhalla, for that super chat. From Sparky, $2 super chat. Half of the states have open primaries. Vote Tulsi.
True.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, this situation in Syria gives you a further reason why. Why is the Middle East in this very disastrous situation? It's because of all these regime change policies that have been followed there, not just by the United States, let me stress, but by the Western powers. By the way, on that subject, and we were talking about Britain before, I happen to know that Tony Blair was one of the people who actively encouraged George Bush to launch that war in Iraq. So, I mean, this idea that he was a restraining force, that he was trying to hold Bush back, and that Bush wanted to go, on the contrary, Blair was encouraging him to do it. So we mustn't just think of this, the US, the neocons of the US, because the US is so far and away the most powerful country. It's where it matters. But the British establishment and the French also have blood on their hands. And Tulsi is a voice of reason and morality and good sense.
All right. From Ruby's 200, will Turkey and Israel unite and create a false flag?
Well, there has to be a real danger. I mean, we've spoken about Erdogan's options, and Erdogan is now desperately trying to get the NATO on side. If things go badly wrong for him in Idlib, well, they are going badly wrong for him in Idlib. The danger that he will try another force, that there'll be a false flag to try and get the US involved. In other words, another staged chemical attack. That has to be a very real danger. It's a very serious danger indeed. The one thing that may act as a restraint against it is that the Russians are there, and I think that there will be quiet words being said, which is that we do not want to launch missile strikes against Idlib, the Syrian army in Idlib, because the Russian military are mixed up with it. And that may be an element of restraint, but we mustn't overstate that. The danger is very real.
Okay, from Sparky, Tulsi's up in the latest polls, may overtake Pete. Well, she should be way ahead of Pete.
We should be way
in a normal non-clown world.
Well, of course.
That's for sure.
Well, I think if there'd been proper coverage of her campaign, she would have been. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I've no doubt.
He would be a front runner if there was proper coverage.
Yes. I mean, I don't, frankly, I mean, I struggle sometimes to believe that Pete is even a real person, but that's another.
Tucker Carlson says that all the time. He's some kind of robot or android.
Robot, exactly.
I agree with that. All right. From Vika Bika and OK50. Was the S-400 sale to Turkey on calculated risk by Russia, given the bad situation between Russia and Turkey now?
Yes, I think it was. It was a calculated risk. It hasn't yet failed because we're not yet in a war. But of course it might do. But I suspect that there will be some people in Russia who will say that even if it fails in the end, it hasn't failed completely, in that it did cause a rift between the US and Turkey at an important time in 2018, 2019, which did give Russia time and space to stabilize the situation in Syria. So they will lose something, in the sense, as I said, that system will be compromised, but not irreplaceably.
Okay, from Valhalla, Bright Hall Seminole, Strategics of €5, Super Chat, Turkey, a global threat. NATO, EU should go south to confront the real threats from the east.
Well, if I assume that refers to the various terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram in Nigeria, which is connected, I believe, to ISIS. ISIS itself, which is still a powerful force. I completely agree. I mean, these groups are, incredibly dangerous. And Erdogan has a history of backing them. I mean, he's backing Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and it's an open secret, universally known, that for a long time he was backing ISIS.
As was the US and Obama. As was
Absolutely.
Obama.
Well, of course, yes. And by the way, that's not a conspiracy theory. Secretary Kerry, Obama's Secretary of State, was overheard and recorded in the UN General Assembly admitting as much. So there we are.
It's me, a $5 Canadian super chat. Thank you very much. It's me. Message was retracted. Your dogs are happy.
I'm very excited. My wife has just come up.
All right. From Sparky, a $5 super chat. Most Americans don't realize in most countries, a civilian government and military have a tenuous relationship at best and should be treated as separate.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that's entirely true. That was entirely the case, by the way, historically in the United States. I remember studying way back as a student, the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership in the United States during the Civil War. The American Civil War. It was striking to see how at that time they were being kept separate. The extraordinary influence the US military now has in the US is a very new and very un-American thing. You were talking about Turkey. Well, it was in Turkey that the expression deep state was first invented. So that gives you an idea of how intimately the military has been involved in policy in Turkey, and for a very long time.
All right, it's me, super chat. Are we seeing an escalation of war against Russia from dogs, or is this just a show of power?
Well, I think that we have a constant siege of Russia, which, as Putin has been saying, has been going on forever. Sometimes it waxes, sometimes it wanes. I'd say, if anything, at the moment, it's in something of remission. I don't mean that it's gone away or changed, but I think that the pressure on Russia has been greater over the last few years than it is at this particular moment in time. We mustn't make the mistake of thinking that this conflict between Russia and Turkey is at the moment, part of some great overarching plan. As I said, Merkel and Macron are not backing Erdogan over this.
Okay, from Jan Schoenfeld, $20 super chat. How might a conflict affect Turkstream?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm going to make a prediction that Erdogan will want to protect Turkstream. The very last thing he will want to do is to switch Turkstream off. So I think Turkstream will continue, irrespective if there is a major falling out between the Russians and the Turks. I think that's a dumb thing, and that it will continue because it is economically so important for Turkey that they won't want to jeopardize it in any way. And the Russians have consistently shown that they're willing to separate pipeline politics from geopolitics. The S-400 sale is a different matter. The presence of Russian tourists in Turkey is a different matter. Russia's willingness to import food products from Turkey, that's also a different matter. All those, if there's a major falling out, they could all go, but I think Turkstream will continue.
All right, from Peter Milne. Alexander Lukashenko and Recep Erdogan have one thing in common, as the RU saying goes, man with bottom of 3 seats.
Well, indeed, actually, I'm very glad that you brought this up because Putin has also been having lots of trouble with Lukashenko recently. And there's been all kinds of quarrels and squabbles and arguments between Putin and Lukashenko at the same time that there's been between Putin and Erdogan. Lukashenko has many personality traits which bear some resemblance to Erdogan's. Belarus and Turkey, though, are completely different countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Flying Boar, what did Assad do to Turkey that made Erdogan so anti-Assad? That is a great question.
No, well, the
Used to be friends.
Yeah, well, the answer is nothing. Apparently there was a meeting and they spent a holiday together, the two families, and apparently Erdogan's family didn't like the Assads very much, who they found or thought they found rather condescending, but that's the story anyway. But the fact is, I mean, this whole issue of the conflict between Turkey and Syria has been almost entirely, has been entirely of Turkey's making. There wouldn't have been a crisis in Syria, there wouldn't have been a war in Syria if Turkey had remained friends with Syria. It was Turkey's decision to open its borders to all these various militant groups that flooded into Syria across the Turkish border that created the war there. So, Syria did not do anything to Turkey that provoked this war. Of course, Erdogan would say that he's defending the Syrian people from the brutal Assad regime. Well, that's what he says anyway. But I don't think that's ultimately what governed his decisions.
Okay. Super chat from Sparky. Pizza Global Intel Community Creation and Puppet.
I agree with that. I agree with that too.
Sparky's on a definite roll tonight. Very good comments. From Vika Bika 50 NOK. Is there truth in that Russian Navy is now consolidating their forces outside Syria? If so, to what end?
Well, there is. I've heard stories. I've heard reports that Russian frigates are now crossing the straits into the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's a show of force. I mean, that's clearly what it is. It's intended both, I think, to let the US know that the Russians are there, because of course the US is the dominant naval force in the Mediterranean. But of course those Russian warships are heavily equipped with very advanced missiles, and they are there to act as a deterrent in case Erdogan and the Turkish military start anything. we would be talking about missile strikes. And of course, the other thing, and this has been explained to me many times, is that that warships have very powerful radar systems. So deploying warships off the coast of the country increases your radar coverage of that country.
All right, thank you for that super chat. And the final super chat, Alexander from Flying Boar, $5 update on Nord Stream 2, please, the other pipeline.
Yeah, indeed. What is now happening is that there is this Russian ship, which is apparently a pipe-laying ship, is apparently on its way from the Pacific. It's cruising around Africa, I believe, on its way to actually to the Baltic to take over the pipeline. The expectation is that it will start work around May, June time, and that the pipeline will be completed by the Russians alone sometime in the autumn, and will start piping gas in the first quarter of 2021. So these sanctions have delayed it, but they haven't stopped it.
It will get completed.
Yeah,
I
have no doubt.
All right,
no
$5
doubt.
super chat from Thomas Payne. Thank you for that super chat. And a last minute super chat from Blue Diamond Gem as well. Erdogan backed himself in a corner with no allies. Great way to sum up this live stream.
Perfect. Excellent way to sum it up. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for the super chat. Thank you to Spartan Warrior Queen as well for helping me moderate. Wayne Thomas, $4.99 super chat. Last minute. Thank you very much, Wayne, for that super chat. Really appreciate it. Alexander, any final words before we sign off here?
Well, we are nowhere near the end of this crisis. Erdogan, as I said, has got himself in a very difficult position. Just as the last person said, he's without allies. He's facing Putin's wrath. And he's got the Russian military and air force, ready to strike at his forces in Idlib, where he's now losing men. So he's got to find a face-saving way when he goes to Moscow in a few days to get out of this mess that he's got himself into. Whether he will be able to do that, and whether, if he does do it, he will suffer very severe political damage at home. We shall see. I mean, that's the other thing. The way this may play out in Turkey domestically is something we need to keep track of, because I can't see any good outcome for Erdogan from any of this.
All right. And Flying Boar sent another super chat. How much Russian Arctic territory has natural resources?
Huge amounts, an awful lot, far more. I'm told. I've had discussions with people about this. I should accept
huge facilities.
Huge. Yeah. One of my closest friends, one of my oldest friends, is a Russian businessman, and he works for one of the companies that's operating in the Yamal Peninsula. He goes there regularly, and which is involved in the doing all the liquefied natural gas there. And he tells me that the true size of those reserves is actually multiples greater than the reported ones. That's what he tells me.
Wow. All right. Sin of Pride sent a super chat. Great broadcast. Happy weekend. Paula McLennan also sent us a super chat. Thank you, Paula. And European 1123 sent a super chat. NATO and EU have given Turkey every form of support, short of any actual help.
Exactly. That's
interesting.
Beautiful way to put it.
Excellent. That's it. That's a wrap. Thank you once again to Spartan Warrior Queen. You saved the day. You did a great job helping moderate the chat. I think everything went super well.
Yes.
In the live stream, Alexander. Have a great weekend. Any final words to our viewers?
And thank you very much for these extraordinarily interesting questions. I think it's been one of the best interactive live chats we've ever had. And given the gravity of the situation, that was magnificent.
Yes. Thank you to everyone watching. Remember to hit that like, check your subscription as well to the channel. Make sure you're still subscribed. Share the channel with everybody you know. That really helps us out a lot. And PayPal, Patreon, Subscribe Star, the Duran shop, V-neck like what I'm wearing, and of course, that awesome polo that Alexander is wearing.
Indeed.
And to everyone who's on this live stream joining us, have a great weekend wherever you are in the world. Thank you once again for all your support. We really appreciate it. Take care.